Hello, and welcome to another GeoTech Hour. I'm your host, Dr. David Bray, Inaugural Director at the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center, and we're here today to talk about countering bot swarms, mass false accounts, and deepfakes. This is a part two of the conversation. We've been having this conversation together in which we already brought together the State Department's GEC, as well as the Digital Forensics Research Lab, as we've approached this topic together. I'm really excited to have the different guests here today as we think about how we move forward together on addressing these issues and recognize that really it's not so much a technology issue. It is ultimately a people issue and how we both as people organize to address the challenge, but also to have empathy for the challenges we're facing and those that may actually be experiencing the challenges of mass false accounts or deepfakes. So I'm really excited to have our guests here today. I want to go first to Eric Sapp. And Eric, welcome to the GeoTech Hour. And I want to ask you the initial question of why are the geopolitics of this so challenging? And what are you seeing in this space regarding these challenges that we're talking about today? Oh, you're muted.
There we go. I'll figure this out. It's great to be on and with this panel. And I think the simple answer, you set it up well in your intro, is this is complicated and messy because this is really about people. And people are complicated and messy. And what's some of the challenges we're facing now, I want to look at this more optimistically. I've got my Star Trek background on with the more hopeful future, that the challenges we're dealing with are outcomes of the fact that data has the potential, because it's about people, to be one of the most democratizing and equalizing forces, I think, in history. And that's why we are seeing geopolitically different state actors with different interests playing so readily and directly into this space. We are having, as the nascent development of understanding of data, digital engagement, the connectedness that comes with that grows, you have different national ideals, government ideals of democratic, autocratic, more communalistic systems that are kind of battling it out for control. I believe, kind of in the same way that the arc of history bends towards justice, that data is going to bend toward democratic empowerment. But what we see is that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good thing. Democracy can create wonderful things that can also lead to kind of radicalized populist majority control, oppressing minority movements. And right now, we're all trying to figure that out. But I think, especially these last few years, as we've seen the division, kind of as a final point, it is important to understand, and with the development of bots, that our future is not set. We are in an iterative phase of this, and that's actually why I picked the holodeck background for this conversation. We are deciding and shaping what this future is going to be, how we are going to both create and utilize data. And those decisions, more than any specific technologies or counter disinformation efforts, are going to be what shapes the future and what solves for the problems we're facing today.
Really well said, Eric. And what I really liked is that you're talking about how, in some respects, this is a transition period. We're in a transition phase in which the future is not set. I liked how you also you focus about it's about data, and it's that data can be a positive force for good, or it can be weaponized or cause really challenging things. And I'm thinking about, when the radio first came out, there were some autocrats that happened to use radio for less than benevolent means. And so real quick, as a follow-up on question to you, what are some of the ways that you see data can be a force for good in this space?
Yeah.
If you can just give us some teasers there.
Well, again, you set me up well with the radio. We need some fireside chats. The biggest difference right now is civil society, academia. None of them are trying to speak to the audience that is algorithms. We are creating things to try to only speak to people as if it was the 1960s again. And that is what is being abused and tricked by autocrats, by bad actors, by criminals. And so I think the two most important pieces are understanding this new world we're in, as FDR did, the power that is possible here, and treating this new audience, which is algorithmic, thinking of it in that way, and also changing some of the ways we create and think about data, because the type of data we create is what trains those AIs, that develops the machine learning that teaches these systems who we are. And attention-based metrics, market-based metrics, demography-based metrics are all about kind of delineating and separating us, and they're not truly about what people care about. So the next evolution of understanding and data development, I think, is going to be one of the keys as well.
Excellent. Well, that definitely sets the scene up now for our next guest. And so, Renee, welcome to the GeoTech Hour. I know you've done a lot in this space. Really glad to have you here with us. And maybe sort of building on what Eric said, he talked about, we're treating audiences as if we're back in the 1960s, but I'd be interested in your thoughts as to why are we concerned about these issues, and should we think about labeling these as part of a larger trend than just misinformation? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. I think nowhere is the gap in communication style or the gap in understanding of what's possible in the technological realm clearer than in the conversation around COVID. So we can anchor this in very specific dynamics, right? So if you looked back to this time a year ago, we at this point knew that COVID was going to be a problem. It had spread, we were all under lockdown. But the conversation, the communication style from institutional authorities was very slow and very lagging. And so you may recall the debate about masks, that this was, now there's a new debate about masks, but last year's debate about masks was whether we should wear them when and how. And the CDC was very slow to act. The evidence wasn't there yet. And so they were operating under a different type of timeline. They were not operating under a timeline, a Twitter timeline, if you will, where when you pull out your phone, you pull up your app, and you expect to see new and reliable information up the top of it. Instead, they're really operating much more under the kind of press conference, decide something, come to consensus in a room behind the scenes, communicate it to the public, and then expect the public to adhere to the recommendations. And that's not how people expect to make decisions anymore. Because when institutional authorities are silent, when they're not participating in the conversation, other voices fill the void. And one of the ways in which this manifests is that influencers have really in many ways supplanted experts, and that's because influencers understand the dynamics of the modern communication ecosystem. They understand how to reach the public, and their expertise may be in something completely, entirely different. They may be a famous actor, they may be an author, a dietitian, what have you. And yet at the same time, these people have massive audiences, more importantly, audiences who trust them. And this is the other piece of it. It's not just a technological problem. It also relates to very big questions about who do we get our information from, and how do we form communities of trust. And so where we are now is this, these sort of communities where people orient around influencers and kind of niche media properties that they trust, and form very kind of insular communities around that dynamic, which has the effect of making it so that someone in community A is not necessarily seeing or engaging with the same kind of facts or information as people in community B. And there's it's way more than A and B. It's like a archipelago of these like bespoke realities at this point. And that's the dynamic that the modern communication ecosystem has created. And now we're trying to reckon with, what does that mean for us? How do we come to consensus as a society and move forward? And that's where I think we focus a lot on social media and the tech, but really it's much more a function of communication and community in a modern, on a new technological infrastructure, on a new infrastructure for speech and communication. But ultimately, it still really relates to how we engage with each other, and what happens when our technology has made that a little bit more difficult.
I really love how you set the scene there with that image of an archipelago of bespoke realities. I think that is a wonderful sort of picture for our audience to consider. And if I could ask you a follow-on question, Renee, so what does that mean for the future of governments and governing if really we're just going to go with whatever influencer we like best? Have we lost trust in not just government institutions, but social institutions that are meant to be necessarily personality less and more about the actual doing the social good? I mean, what does that what would you see that playing out with, or what would you try and chart as a future forward from that influencer model?
Well, I hope that what we see is a little bit more of a kind of excuse me, of a decentralization of expertise, if you will. Maybe we decouple it a little bit from ideas of institutional authority. I think with COVID in particular, again, using that as the example, there's an opportunity to empower civil society organizations and community organizations, religious leaders, for example, or members of local medical authorities are another example of people who are perhaps a little bit more adept at understanding what their community needs and communicating with them in the most effective way possible because they're members of that community. And so how can we potentially take that high quality information, take information that is accurate, not just speculative or sensationalism of the kind that unfortunately really has been the other dynamic with COVID, false cures and whatnot. But take that information and really give it to people who are more adept at communicating with smaller groups of people. So sort of a decentralization of expertise, perhaps, or decentralization of the communication function of expertise.
Excellent. And I really like how you said it could be a decentralization of expertise. It could be involving local community leaders. I'm reminded of how when the United States initially was trying to address HIV/AIDS, public health officials initially tried the idea that if we just told you about it, that would be sufficient. That didn't work. Just telling you the facts didn't work. And then they tried the idea that we could give you some locus of control, which seemed to have worked with stopping cigarette smoking campaigns and things like that. If you felt in control, then you could do it. Again, it wasn't enough. And it wasn't until they engaged the community leaders it was successful. So maybe if I could ask you as one final rejoinder before we go to Jeff is, where are you seeing, for example, where maybe there are actually positive examples of this new way of organizing, working, and maybe to sort of give us hope to Eric's earlier point about the optimism of the future ahead? Where are you seeing where this is successful?
I think that there are, one of the areas where I think we've seen, I don't know that I would call it necessarily success, but where we've seen transitional shifts has really been, during the 2020 election, we didn't sort of cede the ground to rumors. We had a hard time fighting them, but there were many, many, many more kind of state and local entities that were actively participating in understanding the social media conversation and in countering false claims, again, for their communities. And so that, I think, was one of the first instances where we've seen a real coordinated effort to take that, there wasn't a whole lot that was coming from the top at the time, and so CISA and others really empowering more local governments, local officials, local media really came and got involved quite a lot in how we thought about facilitating better information flows. I think local media and civil society organizations and community leaders are really that they still occupy a position of trust at a time when major institutions and national political leaders just don't. And so I think that is where we need to be kind of leaning into rebuilding the base of trust from that ground up.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Renee. And I think that sets the scene up well for Jeff. And so welcome to GeoTech Hour, Jeff, longtime friend of the GeoTech Center and senior fellow as well. We're glad to have you here. And you do a lot of work with both AI and also countering false accounts. And so what are you seeing when it comes to mass false accounts and as well as the application of AI, either to do the mass fake accounts or to actually try and counter it? And are we seeing something of a digital arms race here?
Yeah, I like the way Eric and framed it. Is the shift? Start with the macro and move it down. So the shift from institutions to individuals, and that big trend that's taking place. That's still a trend. We are in an iteration of it. And looking at this, last evening we had a really great conversation at a GeoTech event which had essentially framed around incentives. And I think it's a really important point here around incentives and how they're placed. So just for context, if you just look at in the commercial sense, if you look at the largest market cap companies we have, probably the 3 of the top 5 are incented by engagement performance. And so when you look at that, it means, just give you an example, there's nearly 4 billion users of social media today in the world. So it's an enormous platform. There's an enormous way of looking at how to create influence and engagement performance. And performance is a key here, because that's the outcome versus that's the incentive driven to the outcome. And so when I think about it, it was Spartoro said, their research was anywhere between 5 and 30% of those online personas or influencers are fake. But the incentive, if you have, let's say you have 1 million followers and you are a persona and you have 1 million followers, you could earn up to $250,000 per post. Right? It gets really, really economically incentively driven. So the question is position of interest. And so when you look at the role of how do we counter this, the incentives have to really align with the desire to look at the bigger picture on how we impact it. And until we have aligned the market forces behind that, or to understand them better, to create different incentives, we're going to continue to operate in a way where it's just going to get easier and easier because of the role of technology and the role of even AI tools are democratizing and being able to become much more useful and easier to implement. And so therefore, somebody or some person in the world that can have so much more of an impact just with one person. Before, it was largely driven by either access or a large institution. So are we in a digital arms race? There's a lot at stake. When you really look at, as Eric Vanessa said, you back up and you look at this and say, what is at stake with regard to that bifurcating part of how our societies look at each other and how we deal with. And so, as my old friend Richard Boyd said, the existential threat, including climate change, but it's really it's having access to equality, right? And so that's a real issue. So there's a lot at stake. This is getting a much more significant problem, and it's becoming much more state impactful. And that's the rise. That's what we're trying to counter.
Very well said, Jeff. And I liked how you sort of set the scene that it may be a case where the wrong incentives are shaping some to do behaviors that we don't want them to do here, and that we may need to think about less of an arms race and more of a what are the different structural incentives we want here to ideally encourage outcomes here. And for the previous episode we did last week, we had Sarah Jane Turp and we had Pablo Brewer talking about this idea of zombies, and that basically are accounts that are maybe initially created by a human and then they let them be automated for weeks, if not months, if not years, and then occasionally a human comes in and does something and it goes back to being automated. So it's neither a bot nor it is a human, but it's a chance of doing this interesting sort of zombie or cyborg-like account. I'd be interested, where are you seeing the technology? I mean, I'm just remembering how it used to be, if it was only like this all of a sudden like sharp activity and then it went back to being dormant, that was a sign of a human, a sign of a bot and not a human. But now, of course, things have gotten sophisticated where people actually write the algorithm to actually look like it's doing more human-like behaviors when it's posting online. What is the latest in technology in terms of, that you can share, trying to figure out whether or not something is a bot or not?
This is the big, we're looking at the combination of advanced NLP and a combination of very sophisticated gaming technologies, right? And this is where guys like, Richard Boyd at Tanjo, those guys who are really focused on using the advanced applications of their gaming machines that are very sophisticated, and where we look at the data acquisition, ETL. So I think it's more combinatorial. You're taking different segment market technologies and putting together and saying, what can we understand, and how do we either prove or disprove that this is real or not real? What we're initially seeing is this is far bigger than it's not in our conscience, it's not in our psyche, it's not in everyday conversation. But the impacts. I mean, how many people believe that COVID was started by toilet paper manufacturer and online video platforms? There's so many people who actually believe these things, and it's just because they're so influenced by it. It's really crazy. Advanced technologies are getting, and data availability to tune and train is getting easier and more useful for an individual to take action than it was before in groups. That's the trend. And we're trying to understand and use advanced gaming technologies to figure out how to look at this in a different way.
Very well said. And I'm reminded that I think when the United States was founded, one of the things they were very intentional about was recognizing that the difference between democracy, in which you bring people together, and a mass group of a mob is really, are they willing to take the time to understand those that they disagree with, or are they basically just pushing them to the side? And I think that may be something that we run the risk that, what's the difference between democracy and mob is quickly getting a little bit more blurred in this space, Jeff. And I appreciate that. which leads me now to circle back to Renee and ask the question. So what would you say, in your opinion, is the biggest misconception that either policymakers or tech companies might have in this space? And most importantly, since we like to be action-oriented, what can we do about it?
Do you mean about how the technology works, or what's the specific question
Well,
there?
I mean, it seems like there's a zeitgeist at the moment that misinformation is out there. It's something to be worried about. We must do something about it. And it seems to be decided that if we can simply remove all the misinformation from the internet, everything's solved.
Right. You're going to fact check your way out of fact check your way out of it. Well, look, there's such a hard thing to answer in like a minute.
No, you can go longer. We actually, don't worry. We're only 20 minutes in. We got 40 minutes, so go ahead.
There's always been misinformation. There always will be misinformation. There's always been propaganda, for that matter. And I actually increasingly prefer using propaganda as the term. I think that it's come to have a connotation of state-controlled information in the post-Chomsky age. But earlier, it really just sort of meant information with an agenda, right? Information that tried to get you to take an action, tried to get you to believe a thing, closely tied to advertising and marketing, right? So there's we spend a lot of our time sitting on platforms where getting our attention is the goal, right? And that's because you have to stay on the platform, and so it wants to show you something engaging. It wants to show you something that you're going to be captivated by, so that you stay on that platform and don't go to another platform. So if you go to the other platform, then platform A can't sell you ads. You can't push ads towards you. And so the dynamic that we're contending with is not so much that there is misinformation now and there wasn't previously. It's that we have our information curated for us and ranked for us in very particular ways, and largely by algorithms that are not necessarily, they don't really understand what it is they're showing. They just understand that it's engagement, that it's getting a lot of attention. And so if it's getting a lot of attention, therefore maybe it should have your attention too. And if you're in, again, bespoke reality A, B, C, D, or E, and this piece of content comes through from someone that you previously engaged with, well, of course it's going to wind up in your feed. And so we have this this information system where it's not so much that misinformation exists, or disinformation for that matter, it's that it is proactively curated and pushed to people. So with anti-vaccine content, for example, it was, for years, it was being pushed to people. And that's because those groups on Facebook were very, very high engagement. There were hundreds of posts per day. They all got tons of engagement on the posts. So if you joined an anti-vaccine group, or if you joined a group that was adjacent to an anti-vaccine interest, maybe you make your own baby food, maybe you do something that the algorithm has decided is crunchy parenting, and there's a sufficient overlap between these two communities, it'll push the other community to you, even if you've never gone looking for it, because it's incentivized to show you something that's high engagement that you're going to want to connect with. So it's a little bit, it's not so much the problem of the content, right? The content, if we can hold the content aside, there's things related to the engagement, the dissemination mechanisms, the way in which curation functions now, that has done a lot to disrupt the ways in which people receive information, or the ways in which people find communities. And now, interestingly, now that these systems have been entrenched, that was happening back in 2014, 2015 was when that really began to start. What you started to see was the growth of communities like QAnon, which for many, many years was actively pushed through the same dynamic. If you were in an anti-vaccine group, you would see QAnon content, because it would decide, again, that there was a statistical overlap between anti-vaccine people and people who liked this other stuff. And so it would proactively suggest it. Now, what happens, though, is that just because now in 2021 and 2020, the platforms began to try to dismantle the system of abysmal curation, doesn't mean that the demand all of a sudden goes away, because you've had people who these are their communities. This is where they spend their time. They feel that they are like warriors for a cause, going out and continuing to spread this information. And so you've effectively grown a community of people where, just because you say, hey, guess what, your Facebook group is dangerous, we're going to disband it, that doesn't mean that they're actually going to suddenly lose interest in it. So we have reached at this point an environment where it's much more of these, the internet kind of functions as a series of factions today, where people are competing for attention. They're competing to make their cause heard. They're competing to grow movements and to affect change in the real world through these movements. And I think nowhere has this become more really transparently laid out for us than in the document that BuzzFeed published yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, but related to Facebook's internal documentation of how the Stop the Steal movement grew on their platform, and in which it really details how this was a kind of collected, like a spontaneous networked activism in which these groups and communities were growing. But there were also interesting super spreader dynamics where certain people were doing the majority of the invitations into the group, were doing a majority of the spreading into the group. Very small percentages of people achieving massive reach, as Jeff was alluding to, through the affordances that the platforms have given us to share content. So it's not just there is misinformation in the world. It's really the bigger problem, the more systemic issue is how the infrastructure facilitates the spread of this stuff. And so that's where the challenge lies at this point. It's the structure of the system. But the other big area of challenge, and I would love to hear other people's solutions to this, is that we've reached a point where when the platforms say, hey, we're going to downrank this, we're going to dismantle this, we're going to reduce the weighting of this, that's perceived as an act of viewpoint-based censorship. And so now, not only do we have the entrenched communities, but any action taken to reduce the spread of the content, or to say, okay, we're not going to recommend it now it's just going to be on the platform, but we're not going to push it to people, that's seen as an act of censorship. Any act of labeling misinformation, which effectively is counter speech, is seen as an act of censorship. So we've really reached this point where it's become very, very politicized. And there's this view that like the weighting of the algorithm in 2015 is somehow sacrosanct. Like we can't touch it. That's the communication system that we have today, and we're going to stick with it. And it's sort of it's a very strange. It's a very strange thing to believe that you should lock your weighting system according to some moment in time, as opposed to it being a constantly evolving thing. But it really does again then come back to questions of trust, and nobody trusts big tech either. So any intervention into the system is seen as big tech putting its thumb on the scale because of some sort of viewpoint-based bias. So that's really where where we are today is not the challenge of there's misinformation on the internet. It's that the virality, the velocity, the ways in which people are active participants in the process of spreading it, that's what's different today. That's what's really challenging. And our capability, or the big tech's even capability to walk it back, is very much tied up in allegations of political viewpoint-based censorship at this point.
Wow. Well, one, I would want to say thank you. That was probably one of the most eloquent sketching of the current misconceptions in this space. I really liked how you said that really what we should be thinking about is this is just democratized propaganda. I mean, and propaganda that's not just done by the state anymore, that now the technology allows anyone that's playing to the algorithm to either use it for good purposes or less than good purposes. I also liked how you also shared, Renee, the idea that we seem to be treating what the algorithm decided several years ago as sacrosanct. But I imagine if we did that for science, we might still be thinking that the sun somehow goes around the Earth or things like that. I mean, things are always changing, but it's interesting how we lock that in. Real quick before I go to Eric.
Glad you gave her more than a minute.
Jump in, Eric. I think you
I was just saying, glad she got more than a minute to answer that one.
I got it, but I do want to have a real quick short thought for Renee before I go to you, Eric. Is Renee, if we were to try and advance a healthy conversation to get over some of this distrust about the idea that somehow big tech is putting its thumb on the scale or things like that, I know there's been different review boards involved and things like this. Are there ideas that you have, even if they're just initial prototype ideas, can just be sketch ideas? How can we overcome right now the distrust that anytime a tech company has an algorithm try to label something as being less than trustworthy or possibly not something that's reliable, that looks like there's thumbs on the scale? Is there ways we can involve the public better in this space?
I think it really comes down to transparency. I think that's the sunlight model. There's certain, the DMCA is not a law that many people love, right? But there's the Lumen database, or I'm not 100% sure what it's called now, but it was called the Lumen database, where you could see a record of all of the different takedowns, why, requests that were made, what came down, and I think that provided a little bit of visibility into what was happening. And I think that with takedowns at the moment, we can see to some extent aggregated statistics, But the numbers are very, very large because these are global platforms. This is another thing that I think, on the platform front, there's always going to be the high-profile screw-ups, right? The algorithm took down something that it shouldn't have taken down because it misconstrued a word, and then it goes back up, but the harm is done, and there's a perception that that the platform is against that community. And I think pretty much every community thinks that at this point. Every community has these examples that they can point to. So meanwhile, though, when you go and you look at the stats in aggregate, they're taking down millions to hundreds of millions of pieces of content a quarter for violating a variety of different types of policies. You can go and you can kind of drill down into the statistics of what that kind of stuff was, but it isn't necessarily. It's a little bit opaque still. I think that perhaps there's opportunities to model more after Lumen, for example. So again, you asked for a half-baked suggestion. So
oh, I love that idea.
I'm sure some lawyer will, find me on Twitter to tell me why it's a terrible idea. But
no, it's an idea. I appreciate people putting forward ideas. We can refine them later, but I think that's a great idea to shine some light on it. And so, Eric, Renee seems to be speaking your language because you opened this scene setting up about we need to think about the algorithm and how we use the algorithm for good. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, Eric. Both first, any thoughts you had on what Renee shared? What do you think is the biggest misconception? And most importantly, Eric, what do you think we should do as action in this space to ideally steer towards benevolent ends versus the alternative?
Well, so I won't be able to tie my ideas together as well as Renee did, so I won't even try. I'll just go with 3 points of an answer that I think on the misconception side and challenges. One, the privacy conversation is really messed up right now, and this is somewhat tangential to our conversation about bots, but it's also related because it gets the focus misaligned of thinking about data and having the conversation always in the context of privacy. It limits our solutions, it limits our thought. It also just assumes privacy is a right of the rich by and large. And that part of the conversation is generally overlooked as well in this. The kind of, oh, if everyone just gets the ability to opt out, it'll be good. Well, if you have your iPhone 78, that's one thing, but a lot of people either don't know, don't have the access, or they can't afford to pay for the different add-ons. So thinking about data, our use and everything more in terms of data rights, more in terms of data creation in a context of wages or patents instead of privacy, I think could be a big shift in the way we're thinking and engaging on things that would be very, very useful. Second, is the big misconception, Renee touched on this as well, is that we can't fight these things. We need to outcompete them. And to Jeff's point on the market solutions, that what we need to be doing is not saying, oh my goodness, can you believe what happened? Can you believe what the Russians are? How do we correct that? We need to say, why did they do that? Why did it work? Why did it take off from Facebook? Understanding that most things in Facebook originated outside and were imported in, and Facebook was used to rev up interest to send them back out. What's going on there, and what were people shooting for? What was the need that was being met? And we don't fight that, we beat it. There was something better that people were looking for. And the number 3 then, and it ties to this last one, to steal a line from the Clinton campaign, it's all about the people, stupid. That we have got to get this focus back on real people and realize all the data creation is done by real people. We need to be serving real people, and especially for civil society and public health and others. And we've done a lot. Renee talked about the COVID example. We've done a lot of work in that space, and the number of public health officials that are saying, this is what people need to know. This is what we want to say. We're going to create another PDF that is 50 pages long, that it cannot be read on a mobile device, and put that out as our solution, and then be surprised when people don't understand and get outcompeted by the Russians. Like, it is not about us. It is about the people. And as a quick kind of hard example on that, hard and multiple understandings, last month, the top associated keyword in America for people searching in Spanish for get the vaccine, my Spanish isn't good enough to put it, but if you translated it in Spanish, get the vaccine, the top associated keyword was Sputnik. And that points to both how effective the Russians have been in this, but it also highlights what a lousy job our side, civil society, all the public health people are doing, engaging these communities. And to put a very sharp point on it, the Russians are understanding our Spanish-speaking people in America better than our local leaders, better than our public health officials, and better even than many of their own advocacy groups, because they are just focusing on what are these people looking for and how do we get them something they can use. And they cannot use the Sputnik vaccine. It is not available in America. It is not even the most common one in South America. But because they're creating content, 25% of RT's traffic last few months was in Spanish in America. Over the summer, they had a 10% audience overlap with Univision. Like Joe Biden would have given his left arm for 10% of Univision's audience, and the Russians had it because they were speaking directly and creating content that could be used and met different needs in these communities.
Wow. Well, that one that really puts it in real context. And maybe, Eric, if I could ask you to dive a little bit deeper, because I think what you're showing is we're launching a PDF and we're surprised when it doesn't have the effect that it does to try and like combat misinformation that's out there. We need to go to what people are searching for and engage them there. And I know this is something that you've been leading. So one, if you could give us a few more examples on that, that would be great. And then two, if you were to provide maybe one or two recommendations to the new administration on how we could address this, I mean, what should they do in a way that is in keeping with the values of the United States, that we don't want it to look like state propaganda, but we do want to create those moments in which those people who are looking for information ideally find better information than what they're currently finding. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well.
Well, going back to my earlier point, like, you got to start speaking algorithm. PDFs aren't scrollable in the way, like, you don't get the keyword associations with them, people posting big images. That Google can't understand that to categorize it and rank you up. So just starting to think more and more in those terms on what we can do and how we can do it. And like, we're public democracy, we're a B Corp. I'm in this conversation because we spend all our time trying to actually serve people. And we have been working on all these equity issues. And we particularly we do a lot in data, but we always push away from saying we're a data analytics company because we always assume the data is incomplete. And what we look for are the holes in the data, and understanding where those holes are and looking for them, that they always exist. Again, we saw this in COVID, the number of darn studies and New York Times headlines that were published based on this is what the data shows. And it's like, you're missing like 3/4 of it. And you're looking at overall populations instead of eligible populations. And all of these things, we need to be understanding kind of, again, when you start looking at what are the people doing, what do they need, and what are the underserved, undervalued communities, it points you to a lot of these solutions. In our work on COVID trust, we use a lot more nudge techniques in communication rather than kind of direct correction or educational points. And in starting a program with Kaiser last year that was originally focused on vaccine hesitancy, because we were focusing on trying to understand these communities, back in January, we started saying, we don't think the Black community is hesitant so much. They just don't have access. And then that pointed us to, and you know what? Age eligibility, holy cow. There were all these age things in the data that you could see these huge differences between behavior, not just at the older demographics, but especially at the child of the 65-plus-year-old demographics. We're like, why is that? And then you look and it's like, whoa, 60% of America's white, 76% of the people who qualify for the first 100 million vaccines are white because of the age eligibility criteria. This is a huge, here we go, immediately policy solution. And we're able to run that then through HHS and White House channels that, it takes government a while, but by March they had been corrected. And I think to Renee's and Jeff's point earlier, like, government also needs to be able to speak into these moments and acknowledge it doesn't have all the answers, not do the scientific thing of here's why we think we're wrong that will be picked up immediately and done. But this is our best answer now. And these are some of the things we don't know. And if it changes, it will change because we are continuing to learn and giving you better answers, not because we were wrong before. And so those sort of solutions, speaking to people with, and maybe where hesitancy is right now, there's, with the more rural, white, conservative community, we need to be talking a lot more about how America's really like rocking it when it comes to vaccinations right now.
Right.
Like we had, like, I think it was like last week, we had 25% of all the vaccines in the world were delivered in America. We developed the 2 vaccines that are the most effective and safest vaccines that everyone in the world wants. And we are like doing really well. We're really beating the Russians and the Chinese on this stuff. And we need to be talking about kind of the pride in what's happened with America, which is a unifying factor that brings all of our communities together, but is a message that is much more resonant. You get people that maybe, aren't as quite as confident in the scientists. They don't like Biden, but oh yeah, hey, yeah, I want to make sure we stay ahead in the vaccine race. I'm going to go get my shot. So, but again, that comes from understanding the communities and thinking, what do these people need to hear? What are they looking for? Why would they go to disinformation instead of to their local leader, scientists, et cetera, and faith leaders? That's my last point is, we do see this right now in hesitancy, and it's another example of not speaking to the audiences. There's a very significant pro-life community that is saying, I will not get the vaccine because the vaccines use aborted babies in them. And you have this remarkable set of statements from the Southern Baptists and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that have said, one, Moderna and Pfizer don't use stem cell technology, so they're totally appropriate to use. But is you have a pro-life responsibility to take the vaccine. And so you should choose Moderna and Pfizer over Johnson & Johnson. But, and this is what's remarkable about what they said, if your only choice is Johnson & Johnson, the Catholics and the Baptists said, you still have a responsibility as a pro-life Christian to take the vaccine. And that statement is just amazing when you think about the implications. People who are pro-life would see how important the vaccine is because of that. But that's not being promoted by public health and civil society and others because they don't want to acknowledge it's uncomfortable for them to ever say, hey, if you have a problem with this, these vaccines are better. But that's what that community really needs to hear. And we need to meet them where they are so that they can do what's best and right for them.
Excellent. Well said, Eric. So I'm now going to transition to poor Jeff, who has the Herculean task of following both Renee and Eric with these great thoughts. But I'm going to ask you the same question, Jeff. What's the biggest misconception that either policymakers or tech companies might have in this space of what we're discussing? And of course, most importantly, what should we do about it?
I think Eric and Renee covered it really, really well. I think of presence and position and how they're interlinked or how people think they're interlinked. So until we can discover one or the other, because I would say it's a two-sided issue, just as Eric eloquently said, we have to meet people at the point of where they need, but where the dialogue's taking place. So it is definitely a people issue. 3 things I would say that I think would be of a priority. It's just getting much more difficult to detect patterns of online activity accounts that indicate whether it's a machine or a person. It's getting much more difficult. And so therefore it's going to be much more difficult to detect, especially as we kind of slouch, should we say, toward overwhelming the Turing test. So the 3 areas of protecting privacy, and people assume, one is like in the encryption, people assume that encrypted information is sufficient to protect information, healthcare, education, finance. It's becoming, because of tools are becoming accessible, it's becoming easier to decrypt that and to de-anonymize that. And it's something that we got to look at. Narrative, to Eric's and to Renee's really good point about narrative campaigns, need to be detected, flagged, and countered with some sort of counter narrative. But that's meeting people where the discussion has to take place. And that's a really great point by Eric about having to be able to have a voice in the people and having a political, faith, or medical or educational leadership in that area. Just detecting false information is not going to work. It's not enough. we have to understand how we look at and get close to the point of impact with people and trust. Bots are one problem. Humans enlisted to spread counter-information is another problem. Are all going to get more persistent as technology and democratization of technology becomes easier and more useful. But we have to think about disincentives and what role they play, not only in the commercial markets, but also what they play in trade and how they play in government markets, if you will, or agreements, covenants. And kind of some sort of expansion of the fairness doctrine in that area, right? About actively promoting false and misleading information is going to create consequences. But the disincentives is the best way to look at this versus trying to, put round pegs and square holes everywhere. It's just not going to happen. I think getting in front of the issue is really, and recognizing that it is an important issue. It moves markets, it moves policy, and it's just becoming increasingly more difficult to separate what's real and what's not. And I think my credit to Eric and Renee, really well said about the notion and importance of trust in people. And that's where the provenance really sits.
Really well said, Jeff. And I liked how you said that we need to get ahead of this, that this is something that we can't, that if you're always trying clean up after an event has happened, then you probably are always going to be continuing to play cleanup. If I could ask you, Jeff, as a quick follow-on, we actually had gotten some questions from the audience, and this is going to be a combination of a question that was asked both by Pat as well as by Gregory, which is, should we look to self-policing or self-regulation by the community? Should we look to something where, do we say the regulation word? Is there even possible in this space? Or is this just something where it's such a challenging space? I mean, what would you say would be the role of trying to find some balance between the interests of government, the interests of industry, and the interests of the public to try and work to some better approach of some coordination, maybe I'll say, as opposed to regulation in this space?
Yeah, this is a real, I think the separation is getting much more difficult from this standpoint. But regulation always follows the innovation. It always follows, it's always playing catch up. And it's not that it's wrong or incomplete, it just takes a long time to really understand. So how to create conditions where regulatory moves, regulatory policy can be effectual. Right? And you don't want to over-rotate or under-rotate because it changes the econometrics and everything. I always go back to this notion of incentives and how they're placed and how we can look at incentivizing new ways of looking at policy and regulation. Is there some learnings we can take from algorithms in a trust that we can inspect, or is there segments of, can we learn from other? I always say we will out innovate or out maneuver problems because of the innovation that we have in America and around the world. And so if you just look at COVID, for example, who would have thought that we would be in this condition? We had anticipated it before, honestly. And then how we reacted to it was really fast. And we didn't allow regulation to get in the way, only to work in our sidecar with us so we can keep it safe, effective, and move with speed. I think that same way of looking at it and drawing up the sense of urgency on what we're dealing with. One is to raise a level of awareness, to understand what the choices and consequences, and then look at what do we have in regulation that would help bolster the speed and efficacy in which we deal with it. Lead with the innovation and what role policy choices can make, and start incremental, just like innovation, you start with some incrementalism on how to do this with policy.
I really like that approach, and I think that is a balanced and seasoned approach, and I appreciate it, Jeff. And so, real quick, because we've got about 11 minutes left, I'm going to go first to Renee, then to Jeff, and then to Eric. This is a preview of the lightning round we're going to go to, so I'm going to ask you to try and keep it to 1 minute each. So it's going to be a short answer, but we have a question that came from Michael, which says, does digital identity have a role in this? Do we need to have stronger ways of assuring digital identity online? I'm not necessarily saying that there needs to be a national identity, digital identity, or something like that, but is there a role for digital identity? Recognizing 1 minute is hard to encapsulate that, but I'll go first to Renee, then to Jeff, and then to Eric. Renee?
I think that there will be communities that spin up around this. I've written some stuff on GPT-3 and emergent AI and what happens when emergent AI, particularly text-based AI, makes it such that it's very hard to tell who's creating content, who's producing stuff. And so I do think that there's a model for spaces that have a notion of identity. I don't think that necessarily needs to be true name. I think that Reddit has a really interesting model of like a persistent pseudonym, right? I think there's a few different platforms that do this potentially well, where there's a signal, but also an opportunity to validate or backstop somewhere that you know, to effectively communicate that you are a real person. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see new networks or new spaces emerge around that for people who want to know that they're communicating with real people.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Renee. That's a really great scene set. And like you said, I think it's in almost it's an opportunity. And like you said, it's going to be something that's going to be some communities that'll do it. There'll be certain places where you want to do it and other places where it doesn't make sense. All right, Jeff, your take on this.
Yeah, great point, Renee. I think of individual characteristic, right? And that's what gives us uniqueness. And so just like a fingerprint, right? And so the question is, what forum can we move and gravitate people toward, so we have an individual characteristic that we can choose to opt in or not, but at some point we know who is creating content or who is creating some presence, and then we can place trust and authenticity around that unique characteristic. How that works, I don't know. That's for the real smart people to try to figure out.
But I agree, Jeff, that is definitely pointing to it's a way to move forward. And so, Eric, I'm going to ask you a slightly different take on the digital identity question, which is how one might use knowledge of digital identities to better match what's being delivered to them in terms of data delivered by the algorithm. So, Eric, recognizing 1 minute's hard on that, but I'll be interested in your take.
No, well, it ties to the last one, and this goes to the point we've been all circling around, is we need better ways of collecting and creating data, whether it's the individual part that makes us special. We are missing in our data set what people care most about, what makes us most human. And so bots can trick the systems because the systems just have like a grainy photo of us. We need a deeper, and we need like the DNA aspect of what it means to be human. And Jeff's been hammering this really important point. There are market reasons to do that. There's lots of social good reasons to understand people better, serve them, but people are also markets. If a business really understands what its community, what its market cares about, it can create better products, it can meet those needs better, it will be more profitable. Inequity is a market inefficiency. And all of these things kind of create market solutions. And then this goes to our point of outcompete, don't fight the bots. I thought about doing her as a background. If we have good enough data, it's fine if bots are trying to pretend to be us. If bots start trying to be nice and start trying to meet more needs to prove they're human, and like you've got chatbots and others that are starting to do more of those things, that's not necessarily a problem anymore. That maybe is part of a solution.
Excellent. Very well said, Eric. And so that now brings us to the lightning round, where I'm going to go to our panelists to ask for 2 to 3 takeaways. And they could be either to policymakers, could be to private sector companies or things like that. Going to be interested in your 2 to 3 takeaways. I'm going to go first to Jeff and ask Jeff, what would be your 2 to 3 tweet links takeaways in this space?
I'm trying to channel Eric and Renee. I go back to presence and position. Where are the two linked? How do we unlink them so we can have clarity to reduce the level of inefficiencies, and more importantly, look at the role of incentives and disincentives and what role they can play, and looking at the problem of fake personas online or creating good. They're both. It's a two-sided, powerful weapon, a tool. And if we understand the incentives and disincentives and how to move markets that way, innovation will follow and policy will come in and shore it up.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. And I think that does point to that we need to recognize that the incentives shape the reality in which we operate. Again, borrowing Renee's term, that we are dealing with an archipelago of boutique realities, which I think is just a wonderful image and is what I'll take away from these conversations. And so to you, Renee, 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations as to what we should do in this space.
Yeah, so I would say first, institutions need to rethink how they communicate. I think that would be, and whether and when they communicate also, really, like what is their core competency? Maybe that it's unrealistic to expect the CDC to communicate in a particular way, when really it should be focused on doing the science, and then the communication is decentralized. So I'd say that. I think for ordinary people, the key takeaway is like you are a participant in the process. When you hit that retweet button, when you hit that share button, you are actively deciding to give engagement, to give signal to a piece of content that then is going to in turn be shown to more people in your circle of trust, but also potentially if you have a large following, much more broadly. So I think that the think before you share, think before you react dynamic really, people do have some agency here. We're not just kind of passively floating around in the ether. We are hitting that share button. And so being cognizant of the responsibility that comes with that, I think is something that is a takeaway for individuals.
Excellent. And I really like that idea that, yes, we have a role to play here. If we do a little bit, just a brief pause, if our emotions are up or if we're really angry about something, wonder why we may be feeling really angry about something, and we pause before we hit it, that may be a way forward. So I really appreciate it, Renee. That's a really great way to put it forward. And then Eric, your chance to bring it home with 2 to 3 recommendations for us as well.
I gotta go back to, it's all about the people, stupid. That all the data, all the communication, everything, we're thinking digital, it's about real people with hopes and dreams and fears and families. And we need to constantly have their needs at heart to what we're doing. And then the second would be, all this needs to be turned into real action. We can't just admire these problems. We can't talk about them. And there's 2 sub-points on that. One, when we try real things, when we try interventions, when we try different nudges, we are creating the very data that is the solution. Mm-hmm. And 2, everyone on this, all of us, anyone on this call, we are in a position of privilege where we can afford to maybe lose the good fight. The people we're talking about, not just in this country, but around the world, need action now. And so we have a kind of moral imperative that we have to start acting to create the better solutions and better data that will bend this process back towards a more just, equitable, and democratic outcome.
Really well said, Eric. And I like how you act. Again, it's the leaning towards action. That's what we stand for at the GeoTech Center. And we can't just admire these issues. We have to take it forward. And what I really love about our conversation we've had today is I feel like each of you have put forward very tangible things we can do. That's a more nuanced approach than what I'm currently seeing. So thank you for that. And then 2, that if anything, maybe the next 2 to 4 years we can use, like as Eric said, it is about the people, but it is also about the data being a reflection of us. And if anything, the challenges begins with us and our actions and our biases. And so maybe we can learn more about ourselves and our communities in the process of doing that. So again, I want to give a tremendous thanks to Renee, to Eric, to Jeff. You all have been tremendous guests here on the GeoTech Hour. This has been a very robust conversation. And to our audience, thank you for all your questions. We may have some additional ones that we'll follow up with and try to get back to in some form as an article. But as always at the Atlantic Council, we encourage you to continue to be bold, to be brave, and to be benevolent in the future ahead. We'll see you next time on the GeoTech Hour on Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.